Dr. Andrew Pike and Dr. Robert Reid. Dr. Pike is the Chief of the Division of Prevention and Rehabilitation at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. He is a professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa and is currently involved in clinical research assessing new approaches to smoking cessation. Dr. Pike has addressed audiences in over 30 nations and is frequently consulted on issues related to tobacco use and smoking cessation, drug use in sport, and physical activity and health. Dr. Robert Reid is a professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa and Deputy Chief of the Division of Prevention and Rehabilitation at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. He is one of Canada's leading health behavior change experts, particularly concerning smoking cessation, physical activity promotion, and cardiovascular rehabilitation. Dr. Pike and Dr. Reid will present to you Clinical Smoking Cessation 2012, Contemporary Issues and Contemporary Practice.
Well, good morning. Those of you that have been to our conference before know that generally it's been a bit of a tradition that Bob and I purport to provide some overall introduction to the conference proceedings. And we think it's important that we also very quickly affirm some of the principles which underline how we conduct this conference. And we were very gratified a few months ago to hear from someone who was at our conference and said, "I was at your conference last year, I never laughed so much or learned as much." Which to us meant, geez, that must have been pretty successful, eh, Bob?
Yeah, I think they were listening primarily to me rather than you.
So, it is important, however, that before we make this presentation, and we hope it will seem like a presentation, that we identify for you these kinds of relationships that Bob and I have had with various pharmaceutical companies over the course of the past few years. It's important that you understand that relationship in order that you can assess for yourself the objectivity which we bring to this discussion this morning. I also want to underscore our gratitude to those who have made this conference possible. In particular, Smoke Free Ontario, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, Pfizer and McNeil Consumer Healthcare, which is a division of Johnson & Johnson. So here we are on the banks of the mighty Rideau Canal. And I have to be pretty sensitive about what I say in the next couple of moments because there are American friends with us. And it's kind of awkward to kind of explain that this canal was deemed one of the engineering marvels of the world of the 19th century, at the time that it was constructed in the 19th century. And to explain to our American friends that this was actually an instrument of war against the United States of America because it was designed to get boats up the Ottawa River to Ottawa from Montreal and down to Lake Ontario so that they wouldn't have to go down the St. Lawrence where Americans on the other side, places like Hoppensburg, New York, could do nasty things to the nice British people that were trying to go down the river. Now, as a consequence of Canadians' foresight, we now recognize that this is a wonderful opportunity to bring our American friends up here, not only in the winter when they can skate on the world's largest outdoor skating rink, and you're all expected to do that as a requirement before you get your CME credits. But also they can bring their clothes and stuff up in the winter. This was constructed by the Royal Engineers with the help of large numbers of Irish workers. And as a consequence, many of those people chose to stay in the Ottawa area, and they lived in the Ottawa Valley. And so in the Ottawa Valley, you've got lots of communities that have names like Renfrew and Pembroke, it's Renfrew Scots, but Pembroke and Almonte, named after a Mexican colonel. Nobody who's from Almonte, we call it Almonte now, has any idea why it's named after a Mexican colonel, but one of the people that's from Fairmont is actually the Ottawa Valley's own Dr. Robert Reid.
Speaking of the Ottawa Valley, many of you may recognize that this is one of the high-tech centers of Canada, and in fact the world. And so we're very proud of technology, and one of the things that we've been introducing in the conference this year is our approach to technology. And I have to digress for a second because many of you might recall that Dr. Pike completed most of his education during the last century. And this was before the computer was actually invented. And, so I had to do a lot of explaining when we first started working together about things like hard drives, which he actually thought was a trip to Disney with the family and the in-laws. So he was starting really from a very, very low spot. But anyway, this year we've gone ahead and we've actually produced an app. So before this conference started, I don't think Dr. Pike could actually even spell app. But in fact, we've now produced our own app for the conference. So any of you who have an iPhone can actually go to the Apple Store and the App Store and to actually find the OMSC conference icon on that and download this application.
So now, if you go, because I'm kind of really familiar with this stuff, like if you go into search and you put OMSC in the iTunes thingy, it'll come up and it's free. And it'll also work on a BlackBerry model.
And if you're an Android user, there's actually barcode scanners that you'll find around the display area that you can go and have this application scanned onto your onto your Android device. And speaking of Android devices, how many people think that Dr. Pipe actually looks slimmer this year? Anybody? Just stick up your hand. Okay, well, I guess I'm the only one who thought that. And I thought initially that this might be due just to the normal process of aging because there's a lot of atrophy that goes on typically. Also during that particular time. But then I realized that, maybe it was an exercise program, and I think I've already explained before that Dr. Pike gets most of his exercise by either climbing off or onto the bandwagon or jumping to conclusions. But it wasn't that. And I realized at a certain point that maybe it's the new food policy. So why don't you tell us about the food policy?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you asked me about the new food policy. At the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, we've been doing a lot of work with the school system in our region of Ontario. In fact, all of the 9 school boards that cover our entire region now have a common approach to food and food policy and physical activity. One of the unanticipated consequences and one of the exciting consequences is that the school system then came to us and said, great, you did a wonderful job telling us what our children should eat, influencing the food environment of our school system. What about you guys in the healthcare setting? It seems to me that you've got a lot to learn from us and a lot to apply from our experience. And so, at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, we're now introducing a food policy which relates to all of the meetings that we have and all of the divisional conferences, and this being one of those kind of conferences, we're guided by that so that we've committed to making sure that all of the foods that are provided to you and all of the snacks that are entirely consistent with heart-healthy eating. And that includes heart-healthy coffee. And I thank you, all of you who have very gently made your views known to me earlier this morning about how important it is that you have, 25% butterfat in your coffee or something. But unfortunately, it's not available here. We hope that we can introduce to you a new, kinder, gentler, lighter way to enjoying coffee, consistent with what we talk about outside of this room and what we. So we're trying to walk the talk as well as talk the talk. So we're all here because we understand that smoking cessation is the most important preventive intervention that can be delivered in any clinical environment. And we thought it might be useful to sort of look back a little, look at what's going on now, and perhaps foreshadow some of the things which we think you're going to hear about in the course of this conference. Bob, over to you. I think that's a cue for you, Bob.
Oh, thank you very much. Certainly since the mid-1960s, when smoking prevalence rates peaked in Canada, there's been a long, steady decline. In fact, one of the most exciting things that we can envision over the next few years is that we may actually be reaching an end game in terms of tobacco use. And I think some of the comments that Dr. Hurd is going to be making in his presentation will help illuminate this issue for all of us.
We also thought it's very intriguing to look at what was understood about tobacco a century or more ago. And I'm indebted to Dr. Basil Blanchard from Rogersville, New Brunswick, who a few days ago sent me a copy of this booklet, carefully bound, published in 1897. It's a physiology and hygiene notes intended for a secondary school population in Ontario at that particular time. And it's kind of intriguing to see how things are couched in the language of that day in this particular publication. But it's quite exciting to see how, while their language may have been different, the concepts remain the same. I also want to guarantee you that you are going to learn something about smoking and tobacco in particular that you will have never, ever heard anywhere before. And you can attribute this new knowledge to your attendance at the Ottawa conference. So, tobacco, it's not a food. It creates a habit that enslaves. It's an injury to the user. It raises the rhetorical question, is it manly to do what would be impure for a lady? Now, this is the first introduction to some of the language that you can find in this document. But here is the most astounding piece of information I did not know. Yes, it affects a whole array of human physiological systems, but did you know that eels have been killed by sucking a smoker's blood? This is the kind of contemporary information for which this conference is famous. And of course, it pointed out back then that smoking can affect stature. And people can be stunted.
This might have been one of the textbooks that Dr. Pike studied for
Tobacco is a poison, as is shown by the effects of one who uses it for the first time. The stomach tries to throw off the poison, the brain becomes inflamed, the headaches, and the person becomes giddy and deathly pale. By repeated trial, the nerves, the faithful guardians of the body, become so benumbed that they do not protest against the habit, and the person thinks he's gained a victory over tobacco when he is merely the victim.
This enslavement really continues to today, because if we look at statistics gathered over the last decade or so, we see that there's actually been no great improvement in the number of people that are actually able to quit smoking long term when they try to quit. That percentage of people who are actually successful quitting has remained stable at around 10%.
All poison-taking habits create an unnatural appetite which enslaves the person. Many of them boast to be able to give up on the habit when they wish to. In fact, this boast is a part of the smoking habit. They assume great wisdom and say that when they see it does any harm, they'll quit smoking at once. But they little know their weakness. They little know the power of habit. And it is intriguing to recognize that while they don't use the words that we would use to describe smoking today, clearly their insights into the power of tobacco and nicotine to compel ongoing behavior is right on. Tobacco gains a power over man which renders him a slave, and at the same time undermines his health, deranges his organs, and makes his happiness depend on a filthy practice. His memory is impaired and his will is so weak that he finds himself unable to quit the habit, although he knows it is doing him great injury. And of course, we now understand these concepts in an entirely different way, and we recognize that the underlying structures, neurophysiological structures of a smoker, are different and are altered in ways that make this ongoing behavior almost predictable. And this also allows us to recognize that just as we are very comfortable using medications and other therapies to address the disordered physiology that underlies dyslipidemia or hypertension, but in exactly the same way, we should be prepared to be appropriately prescribing medications when necessary to help individuals address the underlying disordered physiology that characterizes an addictive state. And all of that, those disordered states are probably familiar to you. Bob Reid is particularly familiar with disordered mental states, and as evidenced by his bizarre sense of humor. But Bob, see what you can make out of this.
But this enslavement continues to this day because people express, and smokers express, great intentions to quit smoking in the very near future, so that consistently over the last 10 years, 60 to 70% of smokers say that they are intending to quit smoking and to give up this nasty habit.